Welcome back to another episode. Here in this episode today, we are going to be starting a mindset series. So, Ben, mindset, what's the first things that come to mind for you
Mm.
there?
Yeah, I think mindset is really undervalued, especially when it comes to sales. I think we all know the things that we need to do to be successful, right?
Mhm.
Like the activities, the things, doing the things. But really like alignment of mindset and knowing how to adopt and stay in the right mindset, like that's ultimately what drives the actual outcomes and the activities themselves. And so I feel like a lot of people, especially non-sales people, probably think like, oh, you're good at sales, like you've got the skill, that's what you need, right? But
Right.
the reality is like it takes a lot more than that, especially if you're going to be successful over a long period of time. So I'm really excited that we're talking about this because I just don't, it doesn't really get talked about enough, certainly within companies, right? Like within the group of people you're operating with. So,
Mhm.
yeah. What about you? What comes to mind for mindset?
So many things, Ben. I mean, just to tack on to what you had mentioned there, mindset, I think, is undervalued. It's something that is taken for granted because I think the best salespeople in the world have to actively be working on their mindsets every single day. And I do think that it's something that people that are not actively selling do think that, oh, they're just born that way. Oh, they're just able to do it because they're good at talking to people. And I think that that is something that's like, oh, cool. I'm glad that everyone thinks that it looks so easy, but it's a battle every day as we get up and we do this. And especially going into outbound because we don't see wins as quickly. We have to
Mm,
practice delayed gratification. We have to be in the practice of not getting what we want right away and being able to know
mm,
that it is going to be worth it. And the work that we're putting in on the other side is just going to be great and fantastic. So I think that the mindset piece here is the key of what I have seen successful in
yeah.
salespeople that make it and are really good at outbound and the people that don't and they're just not cut for it, or they'll say, oh, I just wasn't seeing results, or the method didn't work, and they're very quick to blame the outreach method, whereas instead, how
Mm,
consistently were you doing it?
yeah.
Mindset is that big key foundation for us that allows us to show up and to be able to put in the consistency, right? So the mindset is what drives you to be able to show up and be consistent, and without that, it's really hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree. And, you made me think of this idea. Like, I think a lot of people, when they evaluate someone as a salesperson, right? At least initially, a lot of it comes down to personality, right?
Right.
And is this person outgoing? Are they articulate? Or are they articulate? Like, are they good at talking to people? That sort of thing, like energy, and that stuff is all good, right? And something to pay attention to. But like for someone like I'm actually really, I would just definitely describe myself as an introvert. Like I'm not
Mhm.
naturally extroverted. And so part of what goes into the mindset that I have to develop is like getting my energy up, right? Like
Right.
like talking to people is not always like super, it doesn't like just make me bloom, maybe is the
Mhm.
best way to put it. How do I interact and show up to the people that I'm talking to? And so I think one of the things, and it's a great way to start this, is just like, what are some of the ways that you put yourself in position, right? Like what feeds into mindset? And, I think a lot of it is kind of can seem kind of mundane, but
Right.
but ultimately it's, you're building a muscle, I think, in a lot of ways. Tell me a little bit. I would just be curious to know from your perspective, like in terms of the mindset that you have around selling, how has that changed for you from early in your career, right, to now? What are some of the things that you feel like you've learned along the way about mindset in general, but mostly about yourself and how you put yourself in that position?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I first started selling was because I just wanted to be able to pay bills, right? Like it
Sure.
came from a need of
Survival.
like, I need to make money here. And it was
Yeah.
very much in that survival mode to where it's like, I need to make the sale. And it didn't really matter to me as much as far as like, is this the right customer? Am I doing the right things here? Because
Yeah.
I was in survival mode. And I think that I sold like that. Like I thought that that was my style, right? Like a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more like asking very direct questions because I was like, oh, that's my style. Like that's the way that I'm going to be. But as I continued to grow and like elevated out of this need of like, oh, I just need to make these deals or I can't feed my kids, right? That's where I was at, right? So
Sure.
once
Yeah.
you start to like graduate out of that of like, okay, now I can start to approach sales as actual sales. And I was able to stop thinking about me and what I need in this and able to then truly focus on the customer and listen to what they were saying. Because I know I've made some bad sales in the years of people that should have never been
Yeah.
sold a product because me, my commission, what I need, all of that. So then, whenever I was able to kind of recognize Kristen, we don't need to just survive anymore. We need to elevate, right? Like we need to really figure this thing out because this is not like a sustainable place to sell from. And it is just not, it's not a good place to show up and it's not fun to be the person in that mode, not helpful to the customers. How can I impact people? How can I best
Mhm.
help people? And that shift for me was really the biggest part here. And it was a big mindset shift to
Yeah.
recognize it is not about me. This is not about me. This is not about what I'm going to earn from this. This is not
Yep.
about what I'm going to close from this, what I'm going to go do with that money. Instead, it's can I actually help this person? Is the product that I am selling good enough for me to
Mm.
be selling? Right. And really kind of like
Yep.
thinking through these things and making sure that it feels very authentic. So I think that that's the
Mhm.
biggest shift for me has gone from it's about me and what
Yep.
my commissions to how can I best help this customer? But
Yeah.
what about you? How has it shifted for you as you've been in the sales game?
Yeah, great question. I loved your answer. I think similarly in a lot of ways. Another way to say it, with that kind of self focus, because I've certainly been there too, right? It's like, you know, survival, or I'm new at a company and I've got to prove myself, right?
Right.
That I think that's pretty natural, really, at any stage of your career as you make stops, right? You start somewhere and you feel like you've got to have results quickly. One of the ways that manifests itself for me was putting a lot of emphasis early on understanding everything about my product so
Mm,
that I could then in turn essentially like dump that on my prospect, right? Like impress them with my knowledge, or, be prepared for any question they might ask. But you're approaching it very much from like I have the knowledge and I need to give you the knowledge
yeah.
type of approach. Less so focused on what are the challenges this person faces, how could I potentially help them, how does what I sell or the service that we provide, how would that solve their problems. I experienced this recently where I was talking to someone about the service they provided and what they were selling. I wasn't an ideal client for them, right?
Mhm.
But more as a like, who do you know type conversation. And I was honestly just like really struck by how much that person talked about what they did and how little they asked, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know that everybody experienced this. As a salesperson who's very self-aware of the way that I am in conversations, maybe I just pick up on it more than other people. But like when someone approaches you like that in a salesperson prospect relationship, it's really off-putting, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I think shifting that mindset shift is like one of the first ones that you need to
Mhm.
make as a person, is away from me and what I have to offer to your
Right.
prospect in need of. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think another thing too that really comes down to mindset is just having genuine curiosity
Mhm.
about the person that you're talking to. And if you're very self-focused in what you're selling, that is not going to come across, right?
Right.
Because even if you are asking your prospect questions, you're really asking them questions so that you can get to the part where you can start talking and
Exactly.
pitching, right? But if you have a genuine curiosity about this person that you're talking to, like, and the genuine part is really important, right? In any sales relationship, we're trying to build trust. One of the things that I read early on in my sales career, or heard early on in my sales career, is, you know, people love to talk about themselves. So a way that you're able to build trust is just get them talking about like
Mhm.
what their goals are, or what, what the challenges they face are. I think that piece is really important. It doesn't come naturally. It has to be
Yeah.
developed over time.
Absolutely, and that was one of the hardest pieces for me was to be genuinely curious about what it is,
Mm,
and I would call it mental chess, Ben, to where I'd be like, "Ooh, I'm gonna ask this question, and it's gonna have them say this, and then I'm gonna get to come back with this," and it was like, "Ooh, can I guide the conversation here?" And that was not super helpful, right? Like, it was just not
mm,
because what I stopped doing was listening, and I was not listening to anything that anyone would say, so then my responses would come back as very fake, right? They wouldn't not come back natural there. And so
yep,
that shift for me was hard, like super hard to do. But then as I kind of thought about it, I had to sit down and really piece these things together. And
right.
the people that I was talking to whenever I was selling property management had lives that I wanted to lead. They have 5 properties that they own. They
Hmm.
have, a full-time family, full-time job. They're investing in properties. Like,
Yep.
how'd you do that? Like, I want to know,
Yeah.
can I
Right.
learn something from you? Like, can you teach me something? And that's kind of like where the mindset shift went to. A lot of times people are doing things that I may want to bring into my life, right? But
Yeah.
some of the
Right.
people where they may have done something and they could just mention like an offhand comment and I hear that and
Mm,
I'm like, "Oh, wow, that's I need to go figure out what that means or I need to go do this or that." So really just showing up as like everyone has something to teach me, right? Whether it's something that I want to bring into
mhm.
my life or something that I probably don't want to do, everybody's got something that they can teach me. And so really starting to like shift in that direction of like I can learn something from every interaction was really helpful for me to start to make that shift.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it comes naturally, for sure. I think, one thing that comes to mind is, one of the things I love to ask people is how they got started in their business,
Yeah.
right? Because I think it gives you such an interesting picture into who they are and what are the things that they highlight in terms of that experience. And so, as you're talking to folks who own real estate, right? It's like, well, how did you get into real estate investing?
Yeah.
And the answers you might get could be across the board. My family has owned investment property forever, and I grew up turning properties with my dad when I was 12 years old. You get to hear such cool stuff, and it gives you a
Mhm.
picture into who that person is. I think it helps to build trust, but it also helps in your discovery and understanding of what that person is really like and what drives and motivates them. Now, we've touched on this a couple times, like this idea that it doesn't necessarily come naturally, right? Like having this sort of mindset. So I wonder, what are some things that come to mind for you as far as ways that you build that, or, maybe even starting with building some awareness around what might be some shortcomings in the way that you think about things now. How would you tackle that?
Yeah, so one thing that I did that then I now do with people that I'm coaching is I will go through a call and tally up how many questions they asked someone. Like how many
Mm,
questions are we asking in a call here? And then we'll say, okay, we're asking on average 4 questions a call, and that's it. And you're talking the rest of the time. So I think that figuring out where our starting line
yeah,
is super important because then also you could be on the flip side and you could be asking the wrong questions or too many questions that are like super personal questions where you come out of it knowing people's blood types, right? Go that deep. But figuring out the starting line, I think, is the first part there of building the awareness, right? So we have to figure out where are we actually at and be comfortable being uncomfortable because it is going to be maybe something that we don't want to hear. Maybe something that where we're
mm,
like, "Oh gosh, that was really bad. I should probably stop doing that." And then knowing where you are, then we start to set some goals to start implementing things. If we're not asking enough questions, hey, let's maybe try to get in 2 extra questions. Like let's try to get 6 questions a call. Like let's ask like just some very
mhm,
practical implementation things there because If we can train ourselves to ask questions, then we start asking more questions. And the other thing too is if you think it and you feel it, then you need to say it. And so if you're listening to somebody and you like a question pops into your mind and you're like, why would you do that? Hey Ben, I'm so curious. Can you walk me through why you chose to do that? Right. Like we then show up and we ask that question because why I thought it, right? I felt it, I thought it, and I needed to say it. So showing up and like just asking those questions that pop up in the middle of talking to somebody and asking them in a very kind way, right? Like, hey, I'm curious, can you tell me a little bit more about this? And it's like, instead of being like, why would you do that? It's just, I'm curious, Ben. Could you walk me through the thought process that led you here to this point? That's just such the nicest way to be like, why the heck would you do that? Right. So just being able to raise some awareness around what you're thinking too. And if you think a
Mhm.
question, it's probably a very valid question for you to start to ask. So I think understanding where you're at, but then also giving yourself permission to ask questions, I think helps move it forward.
Yeah.
What about you add
Well,
to that piece?
one of one of the things that you just said made me think of, like, I think when you're able to approach it that way, in some ways, it sort of takes the emotion out of it a little bit,
Oh,
like
yeah.
the internal churning that's happening. I had an experience recently where I was talking to someone and they were like kind of going in on a past experience that they had had, right? Like, like didn't go well. When your mindset is not focused on yourself, that allows you to take a step back from the emotion you might be feeling or the need for self preservation. Maybe ask thoughtful questions. Man, not only that, but show empathy, right?
Yeah.
Like empathy is something that great salespeople do a great job of being genuinely empathetic about the problems that the people they're talking to are facing. So it's like, okay, well, I could jump right into telling you you're wrong or explaining why you're thinking about this the wrong way. Or I could show empathy. I'm sorry to hear that you had that experience, and then ask some more questions around it. It sort of redirects things and allows you to really understand what that person might be thinking. You're talking to somebody who's self managing a property, and maybe they had a really negative experience with a property manager, right?
Yep.
You could feel like that's a great opportunity to dive in and, well,
And
we're
tell why
different.
you're
That's
better.
not how we do
Exactly.
things here. We're so much better. That would be the easy, and you can probably feel yourself getting excited to start going into that when really what you should do is start asking more questions and showing
Exactly.
empathy for what that person experienced. So, um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, 100 times yes, Ben, because that is the knee-jerk reaction is, "Oh, you had a bad experience. Let me tell you why we are so much better." And you don't even know the extent of their they may be the crazy one. They may be the problem, but you don't have enough information yet to tell them why you're better. You don't know enough yet to be able to dive into that. And I think that training that delayed gratification, that is that,
mhm,
right? Instead of me being so excited to tell you about it, no, stop. I need to learn a little bit more and then I can really sell you what you're actually looking for. Best of luck to you. You keep self managing. Like, I'll send you a guide or whatever, right? Because we don't know enough yet to really know that we're going to be a better solution for someone in that
yeah,
scenario. The
yeah,
mindset here, I think, is the key piece. It is not about me and not about my company, but about prospect and what they need. I think that is a
yeah.
huge mindset shift for people. I
I'm
don't know.
listening.
There is no magic script that
Yeah,
someone on the internet can sell you to give you the right mindset. You have to train that on your own. I've seen a lot of ads for people that are like, "Ooh, become the best in sales with this script." And I'm like, there you could have the best script in the world, but if your mindset is bad, you're not going to be able to show up and perform at the level that you could be. There is no magic script, no
yeah,
magic. This is something you have to develop on your own and be intentional about it as well.
yeah. Well, and I think too, and this very much ties into what you just said, is that another important piece of mindset is understanding that this is a long game, right? We do really want immediate results, of course.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
we live in a world. I could pull out my phone, get on Amazon, and have something delivered to my house today, right? If your mindset is very much focused on the short term, then man, every sales conversation becomes this like mounting pressure to get a deal closed.
Mhm.
And your prospects feel that urgency at which you're pushing through the call and trying to get to the close. That stuff is apparent to people. And I
Mhm.
think if you're playing the long game and you're focused on other people, then what you know to be true is that I would love it if my solution or what we do was a help to you right now. That would be best case scenario. You have a need, we can meet that need, and that can happen today. It's
Mhm.
awesome when that happens, right? We've all had experiences like that. But the reality is your need may not be right now, right? It the timing may not be right, or you may need more information than I've given you today to make that decision. And so if I'm focused on the outcomes for the person that I'm talking to, then the time for my purposes really doesn't matter at all.
Mm.
And it's a little bit of a spectrum, right? In terms of being super aggressive and being too laid back. You still there are still certainly things that you need to do and execute on and follow up on. That stuff is important. I'm not saying it's not important. But you want to try to find that balance of
Right.
creating necessary urgency, but also not being so focused on the result for your own needs. You know, it's not your prospect's fault that your pipeline stinks and you really need this deal to close because there's nothing else behind it to help you hit your number, right?
Right.
Like that's and people sense that it comes across. So how do you, I mean, like as you worked with BDMs, how do you kind of help instill some of that in the way that they operate? I love what you said about, listening to that talk time, right? Like what's the
Mhm.
percentage of them talking versus the prospect? How many questions are asked? What are some of the other ways that you try to instill that in the BDMs that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is just a lot of repetition around we know what
Mm,
we need to do, but then we also will develop a specific thing that we're tracking, right? What is it that
yes.
if we're tracking? I do have one BDM that I'm working with where we do track the number of questions that are asked in a call. And I will go back and I will re listen to the calls and I'm like, hey, we had a 20% improvement this week. This is fantastic. But for some of my other people, asking questions and really doing that discovery work is the biggest miss that we have. It's like
Right.
because we will then, no matter where we're at in our journey, we have like a tendency to default into what is easy, and what is easy is me just telling you what it is we do and not asking you questions. So just being conscious of what it is that we're doing, and then repetition, repetition, repetition. Hey, we missed this week. Why did we miss? Let's chat about it, and really just getting in and learning from each person how they operate, how they tick, and what is it about them, then what can I compare it to? Can I create an analogy around this? Can we work through this? Like, how can we go from where we are and then just baby steps, right? I'm big on we cannot go from 0 to 100 in 60 seconds, right? Like, it's just not going to happen with ourselves in sales. So, really just milestoning things out and then walking them through what needs to happen to get to the end goal, which may be different for each person.
Mm. Yeah, I really like that. I think it's definitely something that's learned with time and more reps, right? I mean, I could go into a lot of sports analogies that I'll spare you.
Right?
I'm sure you missed all my, especially my golf analogies. Another piece of this that I know we're going to talk more about in either the second or third episode on mindset is the sort of commitment it takes to always be improving, right?
Right.
And I think that's a piece of this too. Most salespeople don't want to be robots, right? You're not looking to just read the same script over and over
Mhm.
again. You're constantly iterating and unlocking new questions that you might want to ask or new tactics as part of the sales process. Like I think that that comes naturally to a lot of people. But if you don't have a commitment to what you're doing, right? Like a commitment to actually improving and getting to where you want to go, then it's going to be really hard because it's just going to feel like a job. It's going to feel like a math equation. Well,
Right.
if I talk to this many people, I'll probably close about this many people, and then
Right.
there's the result, right? Like, sure, like that's part of it. Like that's part of sales is understanding close rates and things like
Mhm.
that. That's not the thing that wakes salespeople up in the morning.
Right.
If it is, it's certainly not me. So
I
should save
think
our
just
account.
one piece there as well, tying this into outbound here, right? In that mindset.
Mm.
One thing that was really helpful for me was moving my judgment of success, right? To
Yeah.
where a lot of times in outbound, we want to look at how many deals have closed from the calls that I've made, right? Am I able to break it down to that formula of 100 calls equals 10 this, then equals one that, right? How can we
Right.
break it down? Which is great, but how do we then focus the consistency of the action, right? To where I'm
Yeah.
sure that I've said this before, but we marry the action and we divorce the results, right? So we want to make sure that we're staying committed and we're staying consistent to the actions that it's going to take every single day, which then ties
Yeah.
into my mindset of can I be continuously improving? And in these calls, what's my goal, right? What is the goal for this particular call? First
Mhm.
outreach, the only goal that I have is can I close this conversation to a point that I could call this person back in whatever period of time there.
Yeah.
The goal of the call is not a sale. The goal of the call is the next call. And the goal of that second call may be the sale if it makes sense for them, or it may be a third call and a fourth call. But the goal of going into each one of these calls is a little bit different. I want to go micro of, okay, I had 100 calls, 50 conversations from there, and I can
Mhm.
call 40 of those people back. 10 of them were a-holes and I don't ever want to talk to them again, but 40 out of the
Right.
50 are great and I can then reach back out to them. Like that to me is a success. And that's the mindset shift, because if we're focused on closing deals, you may not see results for 2 months, 3 months, but sometimes 6 months, a
Totally.
year, depending on what we're doing every single day, and building in those micro wins, I think is most
Yeah.
important for our mindset. Again, just to fuel us to continuously give and give and give and show up every day and be consistent.
Yeah. I I couldn't agree more. Like expectation is such a critical part of this. One of the stops in my career, I actually trained and was, semi managing a group of SDRs that were making cold
Mhm.
calls all day every day. And one of the things that I found I almost always had to break with somebody that was new is this feeling of they needed to understand everything about what we sold, because to them the expectation in their mind is like my success is this deal closing, when actually their success is getting the next step, right?
Right.
It was booking a call with somebody on the team who was a seasoned salesperson that would ultimately try to
Mhm.
close the deal. It's important to recognize that you have to have the right expectation of what you're actually after. And I love what you said about, I just want to be able to call this person again in the future, because timing has
Mhm.
so much to do with this. Um, and I think the other thing too is like, especially as it relates to mindset, you have to be able to celebrate the small wins, right?
Right.
Because at the end of the day, sales is hard, right? Like you get rejected a lot. We'll do a whole episode on rejection. I think we did back in the day too. So I'll be curious to hear what's changed. Our thoughts on rejection, but you got to be able to celebrate stuff. Like, and if one of the expectations for your role, or an expectation you've set for yourself, is like, I'm going to make X amount of calls, or X amount of, outreaches, whether it's email, phone calls, whatever, like celebrate doing that. Don't worry
Right.
about the result, right? Like, because if you're so focused on the result, like when the result doesn't happen, you've got to have the right expectation, not only of how you judge your team and what they're doing, but also yourself, right? And what you expect of yourself. You have high expectations for not. We should talk about that too. Most people have high expectations of themselves. If you don't have high expectations of yourself, then that's a different conversation that we should be having. It's
Yeah.
its own mindset thing that you've got to figure out first.
There is not a lot of coaching that can be helped with that if you don't already
No.
come pre-prepared with some of that in mind.
We sort of touched on a couple of the things we're going to talk about. I think, continuous improvement, right? Like that always learning, always developing. We'll talk a little bit about rejection. Anything else you feel like is important to touch on as we think about mindset?
I think just showing up and knowing that you can get better is the key. Just knowing that it is possible and knowing that you can. People say, people don't change. I think that your mindset can change. I think that that is
Mhm.
one changeable factor that we can have depending on what you're feeding it, depending on what you're doing. Mindset is something that can be shifted if you're open enough to shifting your own mindset. You can't be coached, you can't be told to change your mindset. That has to be something that is self driven.
Mm. Well, I think on the next one, we'll talk about feeding that mindset because I think that
Hmm.
that is really tied into this. What are the things you do, even outside of your professional life, that feed
Yeah.
into your mindset? And maybe what are some of the things that you've told yourself about yourself that, or about the thing that you're doing, that you need to rethink, because this can really limit mindset. And I think growth comes, especially when you're willing to break some of those beliefs that you've been told or you've held for a long time. So that feels like a good place for us to sign
Sounds
off
like
for
the
today,
next
Kristen.
episode is going to be a deep one. I'm quite excited for today. It was another great episode that we have. So,
Loved it.
thank all of you guys for tuning in and listening to us here. And go ahead and listen to that next episode.